Welcome everyone, Costini here with a discussion about the Wood Elves in Total War Warhammer 3. For this video I'm using footage from the Old World mod, but this obviously applies to any version of the game that we're talking about. Now the Wood Elves are certainly a very powerful race in the game, but they're also kind of boring to play within the context of the Warhammer 3 playstyle. To be clear, the Wood Elves after their rework, which came in Warhammer 2, were substantially better to play in a campaign. But they're one of those races that did get reworked in Warhammer 2. Their rework was good for Warhammer 2. But now, certainly they have not necessarily aged in the best possible fashion. Not because they're weak or they have fundamental problems, but rather because the playstyle of Warhammer 3 is substantially different than the playstyle of 2. Specifically, Warhammer 3 has less AI cheats, has a faster paced campaign, has a very cluttered map. Basically, a campaign in Warhammer 3 for the vast majority of races will typically be over after 40-60 turns. The Wood Elves are a lot slower than that to win their campaign, and they're also boring to play because they genuinely face no real challenge in their campaign. But let's go over the specifics of the Wood Elves. What works very well for them from a faction perspective? Well, their army is genuinely one of the strongest army in field battles in the entire game, in both ranged and melee. It might surprise some people who have never played the Wood Elves to know that the Wood Elves have incredibly powerful infantry, and I'm not just talking about their monster units, I'm talking about pure melee infantry. So let's go over it. In terms of lore choices, you've got magic casters and the spell weavers, ancient treemen, which are absurdly powerful, as a monstrous lore choice. Expensive, absolutely, to recruit at 1800 with a 300 upkeep, but absolutely worth the cost and then some. Glade Lord, with both melee and ranged variants. I mean, they're both, but it's more some of the abilities that they have over here that you can see the difference between them. So you've got melee and range variants for the Glade Lords. And then hero-wise, Glade Captains, Branch Wraiths, Glade Captains, Hybrids, Branch Wraiths, Caster heroes, basically. Though Caster melee hybrids, Waystalker ranged, and Spell Singers, Caster heroes, pure Caster heroes that you have. They have good casualty replenishment, they have a good amount of power with their lords, be it in casting ability, melee ability, or ranged ability. Though Ancient Treemen dominate all of the others. The reason behind this is that Ancient Treemen have a ridiculous level of power. One, they're significantly better in pure melee combat than all the others, from that perspective. They significantly buff Treekin and Dryads in their army. Like 20% ward save for Treekin alone makes them far better than all the others. But they also have a number of benefits. Reload time reduction, for instance, speed for Elven units. Yeah. Basically, there's a bunch of lore choices, but the one that ends up dominating, unless you start looking at the offices that they have, the one that ends up dominating are the ancient treemen, which is a bit of an issue that you will see coming up with the Wood Elves again and again. They have a great deal of variety in their roster, but really some things are so significantly better than others that why would you waste your resources getting anything else than that one thing? And that's one of the problems that we need to talk about with respect to the Wood Elves in a lot of ways. Unit-wise, if we look at the Wood Elves, infantry-wise, they do start with very basic Eternal Guard. Actually, their basic unit they can recruit from any forest settlement is the Glade Guard. Pretty solid ranged infantry unit, good amount of range, good amount of damage, and they can fire while moving. That alone is ridiculous. But then you have the Eternal Guard. Decent enough infantry, basically spearmen that the spearmen that the High Elves have. I do wonder why we have like the Eternal Guard without shields when clearly the shielded version is just flow better in every single way and it's effectively the same unit. Just kind of weird decision. I know that recruitment was handled different previously, but there's no reason to never get Eternal Guard with shields. Actually, getting Eternal Guard in general is a waste of damn money. I mean, yes, you do require an additional building for it, you do require the forge, but really, Eternal Guard are just not worth it. I'd rather recruit Glade Guard. And yes, the Wood Elves have this annoyance where certain unit variants do require certain buildings. That can absolutely be annoying when you're talking about recruitment, but really only affects a couple of units. And while it's a problem, it's not really as much of a problem as the Empire, because believe it or not, the Empire has it far worse in this perspective, because the units that are affecting the Empire are significantly more important for the Empire than they are in the Wood Elves, because you can handle a campaign just fine with the Glade Guard throughout pretty much all of it. The Glade Guard Starfire Shafts is just like a variant. And besides, you do have Hagbane. You do have some others you can recruit. You can get the Hagbane Tips version. But anyway, melee roster-wise, you get War Dancers, decent enough spear melee. Then, okay, so you get War Dancers with Astray Spear and regular War Dancers. Both of them decent enough units. But then you get Blade Singers and Wildwood Rangers. Like, Blade Singers are low armor, but their damage that they do is pretty damn crazy. It's a bonuses versus infantry, most of the damage done by armor piercing, and they have magical attacks. Also, they have the potential of a lot of melee defense that costs melee attack. They increase base weapon damage if they so desire, and other benefits including quite a good amount of physical resistance. So this roster over here, while it's certainly not something you're going to bother that much in a Wood Elf campaign, it's actually a pretty good, solid roster. It's just weak on the armor side, so auto-resolve is crap, but in terms of actual power in a battle, yeah, they're pretty solid in quite a few respects. But this is not the main strength of the Wood Elves. Their ranged ability is one of their significant strengths. So you got Glade Guard, then you have variants of Glade Guard. So you get a variant that does a good amount of armor piercing damage as opposed to the basic ones that don't do one. So you get the Starfire Shafts that do have that particular benefit: magical attacks, armor piercing, flaming attacks. Or you can get the poison version that also has magical attacks. Then you move on to tier 2, though in this case I'm tier 2 Orion specifically. You have Deepwood Scouts, and then Deepwood Scouts with Swift Shiver Shards. Now, these guys may have shorter range, though keep in mind they're actually quite capable of holding their range compared to the vast majority of factions in terms of the sheer range they have. But damage these guys do, a good amount of damage. Not as much armor piercing, but they have 2 projectiles that can fire while moving. They have Vanguard deployment. Yeah, Deepwood Scouts with magical attacks are something else. They might not have the armor piercing capability of Glade Guard Starfire Shafts, but they certainly do damage. And then Wave Watchers, which is like the ultimate range unit in the game, or one of the ultimate range units in the game. An enormous amount of armor piercing damage. They lack range. They lack, not range. They lack armor, but they fire while freaking moving. Good luck hitting these guys. Oh, and the best part is, if they're not in range of enemy, if they're kiting the enemy to death, which they absolutely can, they get 15% armor-piercing missile damage. I don't think any other ranged unit in the game, I'm not even talking about the Sisters of Avalorn here, can outmatch the Weight Watchers in terms of pure range capability. The damage they do is high, they do it on the move, they get extra damage if no one's in range. Yeah, these guys are pretty bloody crazy. And that's just their range capability. Now, not every Legendary Lord of the Wood Elves is going to have access to them. Specifically, Draika is not going to have access to them, but they're still pretty solid. Cavalry-wise, we start looking at the cavalry. Not more skirmisher cavalry than anything else, or charge cavalry than anything else, though they're not particularly great in that. Skirmish cavalry, charge cavalry, lots of charge bonuses with things like Wild Riders. And then you start, you go into heavier skirmish cavalry with things like Sisters of Thorn. Can do a lot of damage, fire while moving. Low range, but the damage is there. And then finally, the ultimate cav unit, the Great Stag Knights. Not the greatest armor. That's a recurring theme with the Wood Elves, that a lot of their units lack armor. But Frenzy, physical resistance, Vanguard deployment, and causing fear with 70 charge bonus. Yeah, that is pretty significant. Shock cavalry to an extreme. These guys can really hold their own in a lot of ways against units that may be units from factions that might even be cavalry focused. You might think the Wood Elves are range focused. They are not range focused at all. They have great infantry, great range, great cavalry, and great monsters. And hell, great flying units as well. Or rather, one particular Legendary Lord has that. Then you got things like Dryads. I'm not a big fan of Dryads, to be honest. They're 100 units, 60 armor, decent capability, but Treekin, Treekin are one of the most durable monstrous infantry in the entire game. They will not break. They cannot break. You can't easily kill Treekin. They have so much physical resistance, missile resistance, they cause fear. These guys will fight on a battle. Unless you're bringing fire to it, these guys will fight on the battle until the bitter end. There have been battles where I fought as the Wood Elves with just Treekin being the last unit standing, my entire army collapsing, and they just win the battle. That's the power they have, and that's the default Treekin. When you start talking about things like ward saves and other upgrades you can get for the Treekin, it gets even more substantial. Things like Zoats, I've never really seen much of a use for Zoats. I get the benefit of them, but it's like Treekin or Zoats, yeah, I'm going Treekin. And then Ultimate, the Ultimate unit, the Treeman. These single entities, not my favorite units, but certainly they have a good amount of power. By the way, note, Durfu has Wall Breaker. These guys, it's kind of crazy. And then we get to the flying unit. Grey Eagles, not necessarily amazing. Hawk Riders, though, as a flying skirmish cav unit, yeah, they're pretty solid. In particular for the Sisters of Twilight, who give all of these a cruise missile, and then you have a big single entity in the Forest Dragon. So my point with all of this is the Wood Elves have a great roster of units, though in reality, for every Wood Elf campaign, going Treekin is the best choice, plain and simple. With Ancient Treemen, you can also go ranged, of course, and with the Sisters you can go Hawk Riders, but essentially that's what it boils down to. The infantry and cav, while certainly good, just don't work very well within the context of Warhammer 3. You're going to have a lot of sieges, you're going to have a lot of battles where range capability or the sheer melee brutality of Treekin is great. Having cavalry or infantry with low armor is not so great in sieges, and that's one of the problems. Wood Elves dominate field battles, they dominate ambush battles, they can use the underlay. But the one problem they do have is they don't have siege equipment. Unless you play Durfu, who has the ability of destroying walls. So, yeah, that's another thing to mention about the Wood Elves. Their playstyles of units that are good and are not good depends significantly on the Legendary Lord you're playing. Ryan's kind of a generic one, though he's technically focused on cavalry, but really he's just focused on massing as many armies as possible or having dozens of armies for free. He completely breaks the game, and I find it silly. Creative Assembly changed Orion because he was useless before, basically. Now they made him the most overpowered Legendary Lord of the Wood Elves, but he's so boring to play because he's lacking the charm that makes Durfu, Draika, or the Sister so powerful. Like, I feel like his Wild Hunt mechanic does absolutely need a revamp to make him more interesting, but not this upkeep nonsense. He's the most powerful by far of the Wood Elf Legendary Lords. That's not even a discussion. Because I don't care how powerful an individual army under the Sisters or Draika is when Orion brings 10 armies. And he's not paying for them beyond recruitment. That's instant. Declare war on the entire world. What are they going to do? Stop you? Good luck. Good luck with that. See, the Wood Elves have incredibly strong defensive settlements. Lorem is a nasty place to conquer. The Ilk of Ages has a 15-unit garrison from the very beginning, and these units can really hold their own. Your smaller trees get a significant number of units. Attacking a Wood Elf settlement is a nightmare in a campaign, even when you know you're gonna pay for it in a way you just don't in other sieges. Funnily enough, because they don't have fucking walls in their settlement and they're basically fighting field battles but with choke points, the Wood Elves actually end up dominating in defensive siege battles. I'm not even fucking joking on that. Just the fact they have this more open layout, no walls, none of the bullshit that involves walls and ladders and all that, the Wood Elves tend to be very easy to defend. And that's assuming the AI does decide to attack you. I've played entire Wood Elf campaigns where maybe once or twice the AI launched an attack on one of my trees. More often than not, your trees will be attacked by rogue armies that spawn for particular events that happen in the Wood Elves. No one's marching Doomstacks into Lorem. Maybe the endgame crisis. Maybe the Skaven endgame crisis. Outside of that, good luck they're just going to fertilize the soil, so to speak, if they do decide to go into Alpha Lorem. So that's great. The lack of siege, not so much. Economy, this is where we start getting into the problems. See, the Wood Elves have, technically speaking, a great economy. They can generate an enormous amount of money. They have benefits to, they have buildings that generate a lot of money individually, though the downside is they cost growth they cost surplus points. You don't need surplus points to get the main building up. You need surplus points for your main economic buildings, as well as the specialist buildings for like Spell Singers and Astray Forge. That is it. You don't need them for any of the recruitment buildings, but you do need them for economy and the military support buildings, and also potentially like some of these buildings over here for garrisons. So don't bother with that. Your garrisons are strong enough as they are. Here's the issue as I see it. While the economy is good, Wood Elves only gain money for the settlements. The climate doesn't matter to them. That's great. But the minor settlements, the only reason you care about minor settlements is because you want to get the growth specifically from them. Oh, you don't even, like, you want to grow the trees in an area that you have the big trees, basically, including the Oak of Ages. And you do want to get growth because, like, when you take a minor settlement, it can affect the growth of settlements around them. But you don't really care too much about these settlements for economic support. You may care for growth, you may care for forest health, but you're playing a very passive campaign. You may win every battle in the campaign, take an enormous amount of territory, and you just don't care for it. You can also make alliances with virtually every faction in the world because trading territory that you don't need, I emphasize this, you don't need them, and the forest health will increase if you give it to an ally. So you can trade territory, be rich beyond measure, and safe beyond measure. It kind of loses its charm. And also because you're in a recruitment is tied to the trees, venturing too far out is a risky proposition. You don't care if you lose an army, but you don't need to venture beyond that to win a campaign. I think that's perhaps one of the dynamics I'd like to see, like having a campaign mechanic where the Wood Elves do have reasons to go for further settlements. Not for the sake of fucking forest health, though. That would be really annoying. Or for Amber, that was awful before. No, but more like objectives they could have that would make it worth it in some way, shape, or form. Missions that you could go for, as opposed to just like taking a lot of territory, annihilating factions, taking their territory, selling it to allies, and then being rich beyond measure. That's what's broken about the Wood Elves. They're not bad. They're just dull within the context of a Warhammer free campaign, because if you're not having to expand it across the map, if you're not having to take territory, if you're not having to engage beyond the limited realm that surrounds each tree, even with map teleportation, remember this, then the campaign itself is not necessarily that interesting. On top of that, healing these trees, which are campaign objectives, just takes significantly more time than it does in any other campaign. Winning a Wood Elf campaign is slow, but it's not slow because it's challenging. It's slow just because the bar takes a while to fill up, regardless of what you do. And once you fill up, that's it, right? You can basically sit on your ass and do very little in a Wood Elf campaign and win beyond the early game, but it's a really slow and boring process to get involved. There's a lot of power, there's a lot of benefits to it. It's just not really that compelling, I suppose, when there's nothing at stake in a campaign. That's my perspective. And that's where the Wood Elves are right now. A really powerful race that's kind of dull to play. And also lacks siege capability, and Orion is still broken.